Take a breath with me. A slow one. In, out. Now picture a child, not with toys in their hands, not with laughter on their lips. Picture a child with chains on their wrists, their ankles raw with iron, their small frame bent under the weight of sugarcane stalks taller than their body. They were too small to fight, but big enough to be chained. Too young to carry a sword, but old enough to carry a whip scar. They were children stolen to build an empire of sugar. Most histories of slavery tell you about men in the fields, women in kitchens, overseers on horseback. But what they rarely tell you is that children were there too. Thousands, tens of thousands. Children who should have been learning to walk, learning to write, learning to dream, but instead learned to endure hunger, beatings, endless labor. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you are 7 years old. Your world should be schoolyards and stories, bedtime songs and mornings of play. But in Brazil's sugar empire, being 7 meant cutting cane under the sun until your skin blistered. Being 10 meant carrying buckets of boiling syrup in the mill, the steam scalding your lungs. Being 12 meant working from dawn until stars lit the sky, with no break, no chance to be a child. And this was not rare, this was routine. Brazil was the beating heart of the Atlantic slave trade. More enslaved Africans were forced into Brazil than into any other place in the Americas. Over 4 million, and among them were children, torn from their families in Africa or born into bondage in senzalas. The slave quarters, their lives began not with hope but with chains. Imagine the port of Salvador, Bahia, in the early 1800s. The salty air burns your nose. The dock is crowded with ships, their bellies filled with human cargo. Among the men and women stumbling out are children, tiny bodies barely surviving the voyage across the ocean. Some cling to mothers who are ripped away. Some stand alone, eyes wide, unable to understand why the world they knew has vanished. The merchants examine them like livestock, teeth pulled open, limbs inspected. A child of 6 is judged by how strong their arms look, how sturdy their legs seem. Buyers whisper about future labor, as if childhood is only a waiting room for exploitation. Those who survive the auction are taken inland, toward the sugar plantations. And here, the sugar empire devours them. Sugar was called white gold. It was the wealth of empires, the sweetness on European tables, the luxury that crowned kings. But for every spoonful of sugar, there was a child's tear. For every cube dropped into tea in London or Paris, there was a small body bent under a whip in Bahia or Pernambuco. Children did not escape labor. They were woven into it. They fetched water for boiling houses. They carried bundles of cane. They fanned fires that burned day and night in the mills. They swept floors, cleaned tools, and when they grew older, they joined the cutting lines in the fields. There was no waiting. Childhood was not a stage, it was a sentence. And what made this cruelty even sharper was a knowledge of what was lost. These were not children without culture. Many carried songs from Africa, stories whispered in stolen moments. They remembered lullabies sung in languages the masters could not understand. Even the very young, born in Brazil, inherited fragments of that memory from parents and grandparents. Yet these memories were buried under cane stalks and drowned in sweat. Pause with me here. Take that image in, because it's easy to let numbers blur the truth. 4 million enslaved, thousands of children, but behind each number was a name never written down, a small hand, a silenced voice. Think of a boy who once chased goats in an African village, now chasing rats in a Brazilian dungeon for food. Think of a girl who once braided flowers into her hair, now forced to braid straw mats on a dirt floor in the senzala. Childhood inverted, innocence consumed. The masters knew the value of children, not as humans, but as investments. A child could live longer under bondage, produce more years of labor, more generations of enslaved descendants. To the plantation, a child was not a soul. They were capital. And yet, even in this horror, there was humanity. Children laughed, though softly, secretly. They played in stolen seconds, turning sticks into dolls, pebbles into games. They found ways to survive, to remember what it meant to be alive. Their very survival was resistance. But survival was not always enough. Because some children disappeared into darker places. Beneath the plantations, beneath the mansions, beneath the churches, there were dungeons, calabucos, places where even adults broke. Imagine being 10 years old and dragged down stone steps into a chamber of darkness. The air damp, the walls slick with mold, the chains waiting for wrists too small to fill them. A dungeon is terror for anyone, but for a child, it is the end of innocence itself. Mothers tried to shield them. Fathers tried to resist. But children were punished too. Locked away, starved, whipped, used as examples to terrify others. And yet, even there, the spirit of resistance whispered. Some children hummed songs their parents taught them. Some held each other's hands in the dark. Some refused to cry, even when tears would have been expected. This is a part history often hides. That resistance was not only in rebellions and uprisings. Resistance lived in every breath a child took in defiance of a system that wanted them silent. Let's step back again. Look at the bigger picture. The sugar empire stretched across Brazil, Bahia, Pernambuco, Rio de Janeiro. Miles of cane fields, dozens of mills, thousands of lives consumed. And within this empire, children's bodies were the smallest gears in the largest machine. Gears that turned without rest. European visitors sometimes wrote of little blacks carrying water or tending fires, often in casual tones, as if describing pets. They did not see suffering, or rather, they chose not to. The luxury on their tables depended on not seeing. And so, the world sipped sweetness, blind to the bitterness that produced it. But we must not be blind. Not now, not anymore. History demands we look. Look into the eyes of a child standing in a cane field at sunset, shackles heavy on their ankles. Look at the small figure in the shadow of a mill, coughing in the steam of boiling syrup. Look at the silence of a child who should be laughing, but knows laughter can bring punishment. These are not ghosts. These are memories. And they ask us to remember, because to forget them is to kill them twice. Step further with me, deeper into the fields, past the laughter of masters in their mansions, past the stone walls of churches, past the noise of markets, into the heart of the sugar empire, the plantations themselves. At dawn, when the roosters crow, the children rise, not in soft beds, not to the smell of bread baking, but from the dirt floors of the senzalas. Their bodies are already sore, their bellies empty. Before the sun climbs high, overseers are shouting, whips snapping, commands echoing through the still air. And the children line up with baskets, buckets, machetes too heavy for their hands. Imagine being 8 years old, the sun already burning your shoulders, and your task is to carry water to the cutters. The bucket is bigger than your torso. It sloshes with each step, soaking your legs, cutting into your palms. If you stumble, if you spill, the whip cracks. There is no margin for error. Childhood is not forgiveness. Childhood is another word for exhaustion. Others are sent to the cane fields directly. The cane stalks rise taller than their heads, sharp-edged, slicing skin like knives. They drag smaller blades through stalks, clearing leaves, cutting weeds, preparing ground for older workers. Some cut cane themselves, their small arms trembling under strain, the stalks heavier than their bodies. The overseers watch, perched high on horses, ready to strike. Every breath is sticky with the scent of sugar cane, sweet and sickly, clinging to their throats. Sweat pours into eyes, blurring vision. Backs bend and never straighten. Hours stretch into eternity. And yet, the work does not end when the sun begins to fall, because the mills call. Step into a mill house. The sound hits you first. The grinding roar of rollers crushing cane, the hiss of steam from cauldrons, the groan of wood and iron under constant strain. The air is thick, choking. Sugar dust clings to every surface. Firelight flickers red on the walls. Here, children work too. Their small bodies slip into spaces adults cannot. They feed cane stalks into rollers. They sweep floors slick with syrup. They fan fires that burn day and night, flames so hot the skin blisters if you stand too close. Accidents are common, too common. Fingers caught in gears, hands crushed in rollers, bodies scalded by boiling syrup. A scream cuts through the air, then silence, then work resumes. A child disappears from a line, carried out wrapped in cloth, while the others keep feeding the fire. And what happens to those who can no longer work? Sometimes they vanish. Plantation records rarely mention them. A child lost, a child missing, but the silence tells its own story. Some were buried in shallow graves near the fields. Some were left in the dungeons beneath. Some simply disappeared into the night, never spoken of again. Pause here. Ask yourself, how many names were lost this way? How many graves hold children whose voices were never recorded? How much sweetness in the world was purchased with their silence? The cruelty was not random. It was systematic. Children were punished for slowness, for mistakes, for moments of defiance. Some were whipped until their backs bled. Some were forced into stress positions, arms stretched, bodies tied to posts until their muscles gave out. Some were locked in darkness for hours, for days. Imagine a child who still sucks their thumb, chained in a pitch-black dungeon, crying until their throat burns with no one to hear. And sometimes, the punishments were public. Children whipped in front of others to teach obedience. A message carved into small bodies. This is what happens if you resist. But here is the part the masters never understood. Pain does not always break. Sometimes it hardens. In the senzalas, at night, whispers grew. A lullaby sung by a mother to her child carried more than comfort. It carried history, stories of Africa, stories of ancestors, stories of life beyond chains. Children learned these songs even as they fell asleep on dirt floors. Even as they woke to labor at dawn, the melodies remained, a quiet defiance. And sometimes laughter returned. Children found ways to play with pebbles, with sticks, with shadows cast on the wall. Even when overseers prowled, even when the threat of punishment hung heavy, they carved out stolen moments of humanity. And in those moments, the empire trembled, because it meant the system had not won. Still, the burden was unbearable. By age 10, some children were already scarred, their bodies bent, their souls weary. By 12, some looked like men, not because they had grown, but because innocence had been stripped away. By 15, many were considered fully fledged laborers, their childhoods erased entirely. And yet, through it all, resistance simmered. Some children joined escapes into the forests. Quilombos, communities of the escaped, welcomed them. They carried messages, delivered warnings, spread songs of revolt. Some were caught, dragged back, punished brutally. But even their attempts left cracks in the empire's walls. Others resisted in silence. A small act here, a delay there, dropping a stalk of cane, letting water spill, a defiant glance that said, "I am still human." And some resisted in ways history never recorded. Their names lost, their acts invisible, but their defiance alive in memory. Step with me into one more place, the church. On Sundays, masters brought enslaved children to services. Priests preached obedience, quoting scripture twisted into chains. They told children to honor their masters as if they were parents, to accept suffering as holy, to wait for reward in the afterlife. But what those priests did not hear were the prayers whispered under breath in African tongues. Prayers not of obedience, but of survival. Prayers that spoke of oryxes, spirits of thunder, of rivers, of freedom. Even here, even under the watchful eyes of the cross, children carried hidden faiths, hidden hopes. And this is the contradiction that defined their lives. Above ground, beauty and sanctity. Beneath, horror and silence. On the surface, sugar and wealth. Beneath it, children's tears. Pause again. Picture this. A plantation at sunset. Golden light spilling across endless cane fields. A mansion gleaming on the hill. Smoke rising from the mill. And in the shadow of it all, a small figure, a child, walking alone, carrying a bucket too heavy for their arms. The beauty of the scene hides the truth that empires were built on stolen childhoods. And so, we must remember, because if we forget the children, we forget the truth. Their voices may not have been written. Their stories may have been silenced. But silence itself is a story. It tells us what the masters feared most, that even the smallest voice could one day be heard. Step with me downward, past the cane fields, past the boiling houses, past the mansions and churches, down the stone steps carved into the earth, down where light fades and the air thickens, down into the dungeons. For adults, these places were terror. For children, they were nightmares turned real. Picture the door first, iron heavy, rusted. It groans when it opens, as if the earth itself resists revealing what lies within. Behind it, darkness so complete it presses against your skin. The smell hits you, the stench of mold, rot, human waste, sweat baked into stone. The sound follows, chains rattling softly, the breathing of bodies you cannot see. Now imagine you are 10 years old, dragged inside by men whose faces you barely see. Your wrists bound, your small frame shoved against cold stone. The door slams shut, the torchlight vanishes, and silence, thick, choking silence, becomes your only companion. This is a Calabuco. Children were not spared. If they stumbled, if they slowed, if they dared to defy, they could be thrown here, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, sometimes until their bodies gave out. The punishments varied. So were chained iron rings bolted into the walls. The chains cut into their wrists, too big for small bones, leaving raw skin. Some were forced in distressed positions, crouching or kneeling on stone floors until their legs shook, their muscles seized, and they collapsed in pain. Some were shackled by the neck, barely able to move, their tiny bodies stretched against the wall like broken dolls. Food was scarce, water rarer still. Hunger gnawed, thirst burned, but worse than either was the darkness. In the dark, a child's imagination becomes both enemy and refuge. Shadows twist into monsters. Every breath sounds like a ghost. But in that same darkness, memory survives. Songs surface. Stories return. Listen closely here. Beneath the cries and the silence, there is something else. Humming, a faint melody. One child hums a tune their mother taught them. Another joins. Soon the chamber is vibrating with song. Soft, defiant. A pulse of life in a place designed for death. That was resistance. Not rebellion with swords, not escape in the forest, but survival in sound. A way of saying, you cannot erase me. I exist. I remember. But not all could endure. Some broke. A child left in isolation too long began to whisper to shadows, speaking to ancestors imagined in the dark. Some screamed until their voices vanished. Some went silent forever. Their small bodies carried out at night, buried in unmarked graves, their names never spoken again. And yet, even in this horror, there were moments of impossible courage. Imagine two children chained side by side. One reaches out a hand in the dark, finds the other's fingers, squeezes tight. Nothing is said, but in that single gesture lives an entire world of defiance. We are not alone. We are still human. We will survive this night. This is what the dungeons could never crush. The masters built them to silence, but silence always leaks. Screams seeped through stone, whispers echoed in the fields above. Everyone knew what lay below. The fear was intentional. The dungeon was theater. Punishment not only for the body inside, but for the ears outside. And yet, the theater had its flaws. Because when you force a community to witness cruelty, you also feed its resolve. Parents whisper to children, hold on, remember Haiti, remember Palmares. Names of resistance slipped into the air, even in whispers, even in terror. Pause again, breathe this in. Imagine yourself 10 years old, sitting in pitch blackness, your stomach empty, your wrists aching in iron. Around you cough sobs, prayers. You do not know if you'll ever leave, but you hum a song anyway. That hum becomes your rebellion. That hum becomes history. Rebellion was the nightmare that haunted every master's sleep. And children, small, underestimated, often overlooked, were part of that nightmare too. Because if a child could carry water, they could also carry messages. If a child could run errands, they could also run warnings. If a child could listen without being noticed, they could also pass secrets. And so, when whispers of revolt spread through plantations, children's voices were there, soft but vital, echoing through the night. Picture this, dusk settling over the fields. A boy no older than 12 slips between cane stalks, carrying a whispered message from one group of enslaved men to another. His bare feet move silently, his small size keeping him hidden. That night, he is not just a child. He is a courier of rebellion. But rebellion came at a cost. In 1835, Salvador burned with the male revolt. Enslaved Africans and their descendants, many of the Muslims, carried banners, swords, and courage into the streets. And while official records emphasize the adult fighters, oral memory tells of children too, running in the chaos, carrying water, carrying blades. And now, we reach the end of this journey. We have walked through cane fields burning with the sun. We have entered mills filled with smoke and fire. We have stepped into dungeons where darkness tried to erase memory itself. We have listened to the faint voices of children stolen, silenced, forgotten. But memory does not die. Their voices are still here, whispering to the cracks of history, echoing in the ruins, vibrating in every story we dare to tell. So I ask you, what will you do with this memory? Will you let it fade into silence, the way their masters intended? Or will you carry it forward? Speak it aloud, keep it alive? Because every time you remember, every time you tell someone else, every time you refuse to let silence win, you give those children a voice again. Do not let them be forgotten. Do not let history bury them twice. If this story moved you, if it shook you, if it opened your eyes to truths that were hidden, then stay with us. There are more doors to open, more silences to break, more forgotten voices waiting to be heard. Subscribe for Hidden History. Share this story so that others will listen, because history is not just about the past. It is about what we choose to remember in the present. The sugar empire thought it could steal their childhoods, bury their names, erase their truth. But tonight, by listening, by remembering, by speaking, we have broken that silence. And as long as we remember, they are never gone. As long as we remember, freedom survives.